For more than 2 decades, governments across the developed world have repeated the same reassurance. Taxes are not going up, budgets may be tight, debt may be high, but officially, the tax burden on ordinary citizens has remained stable. And yet, for millions of families, something feels deeply wrong. Savings that once felt secure now seem to shrink every year. Housing, healthcare, education, and energy absorb a larger share of income. Paychecks rise on paper, but life feels more expensive, more fragile, more uncertain. If taxes didn't rise, where did the money go? This is not a story about careless spending or individual failure. It is the story of a hidden tax, one that doesn't appear on a payslip, doesn't require a parliamentary vote, and rarely sparks protests in the streets. A tax collected quietly through inflation, debt, and the slow erosion of purchasing power. And once you understand how it works, it becomes clear why it has become the preferred tool of modern governments and why the middle class has paid the price. To understand this hidden tax, we have to step back and reframe what inflation actually is. Most people are taught to think of inflation as a technical phenomenon. Too much demand, not enough supply, a temporary imbalance that central banks can fine-tune with interest rates. But inflation is not just an economic outcome. It is a political decision with economic consequences. At its core, inflation is a way of redistributing resources without explicitly naming the winners and losers. When prices rise faster than wages, purchasing power is transferred. When money loses value, debt becomes easier to repay. And when assets rise faster than incomes, those who already own them pull further ahead. This is why inflation behaves so differently from traditional taxes. A tax increase is visible. It is debated. It creates political backlash. Inflation, by contrast, feels like bad luck, like an external force, like something that simply happens. And that is precisely why it is so powerful. The modern story of the hidden tax begins in the late 20th century, but it accelerated dramatically after one moment: the global financial crisis of 2008. As banks collapsed and credit markets froze, governments faced a terrifying choice: allow the system to fail or intervene at unprecedented scale. They chose intervention. Central banks slashed interest rates to near zero. They created new money to buy government bonds and financial assets. What began as an emergency response soon became a permanent feature of the global economy. This process was given a technical name, quantitative easing, but its effect was simple. Money became cheaper, debt became easier, and asset prices began to rise. At first, inflation appeared subdued. Consumer prices moved slowly. Official metrics stayed calm. But beneath the surface, something else was happening. Asset inflation. Stock markets surged. Housing prices climbed year after year. Financial assets appreciated far faster than wages. For those who owned assets, this era felt like stability, even prosperity. For those who didn't, it felt like the ground was quietly shifting beneath their feet. This was the first phase of the hidden tax, not through rising grocery bills, but through missed opportunities. The cost of entry into wealth rose faster than incomes could keep up. Then came the second shock, the pandemic. Governments shut down economies almost overnight. To prevent collapse, they did something even more radical than in 2008. They spent, and they borrowed, and they printed. In the United States alone, trillions of dollars were injected into the economy in a matter of months. Europe followed a similar path. Japan doubled down on a strategy it had already been pursuing for decades. At first, this looked like salvation. Businesses survived. Households received checks. Unemployment spikes were softened. But inflation doesn't respond instantly. It builds pressure quietly, then releases it suddenly. By 2021 and 2022, that pressure exploded. Prices rose at rates not seen in 40 years. Energy costs surged. Food prices climbed. Rent followed. Once again, governments insisted this was temporary, a supply shock, a post-pandemic adjustment. But the deeper cause ran far deeper: debt. Public debt levels had reached historic highs long before the pandemic, and servicing that debt became dangerously expensive as interest rates rose. This is where the hidden tax reveals its true function. When governments borrow heavily, they face 3 options. They can raise taxes, they can cut spending, or they can allow inflation to erode the real value of what they owe. Raising taxes is politically toxic. Cutting spending provokes backlash. Inflation, by contrast, spreads the cost quietly across the entire population. Every percentage point of inflation reduces the real value of government debt, but it also reduces the real value of wages, savings, and fixed incomes. In other words, inflation is a transfer from creditors to debtors, from savers to borrowers, from the private sector to the state, and it does not affect everyone equally. Consider 2 households. One owns property, stocks, or other assets. The other relies primarily on wages and savings. When inflation rises, assets often adjust upward. Housing prices rise. Equities benefit from nominal growth, but wages lag. Savings lose purchasing power. Renters face rising costs without the protection of ownership. This is how inflation becomes a regressive tax, hitting hardest those least able to protect themselves. The effect is subtle but cumulative. A few percent each year doesn't feel catastrophic, but over a decade, it reshapes society. This dynamic plays out differently across countries, but the underlying mechanism is strikingly similar. In the United States, the dollar's global role allows deficits to persist longer than elsewhere. Foreign demand for U.S. debt absorbs some of the shock, but even here, the middle class feels the squeeze. In Japan, decades of low growth and aggressive monetary policy normalized debt and inflation management. Households adapted, but at the cost of stagnation and demographic decline. In Europe, inflation collided with political fragmentation. Rising prices fueled protests, electoral volatility, and growing distrust in institutions. In emerging markets, the consequences were even harsher. Weaker currencies amplified inflation. Capital fled. Living standards fell sharply. Different outcomes. Same underlying trade-off. Inflation allowed governments to delay painful decisions, but only by shifting the burden. And the longer this continues, the more corrosive the effects become. The hidden tax doesn't just reshape balance sheets, it reshapes behavior. When people lose faith in the value of money, they change how they live. They speculate. They hoard assets. They abandon long-term planning. Savings become pointless. Productive investment gives way to financial survival. This is where economics bleeds into politics. As living standards stagnate, frustration grows. Trust in institutions erodes. Extremism finds fertile ground. History offers countless examples. From the inflationary spirals of the 1970s, to the debt-driven crises of Latin America, to the social unrest that follows prolonged economic pressure. Inflation doesn't just redistribute wealth, it redistributes power. Those closest to the flow of money, governments, financial institutions, asset owners, adjust quickly. Those farther away feel the shock last and hardest. And yet, the system persists. Why? Because the alternatives are even more painful. True fiscal reform requires sacrifice. It demands honesty about what can and cannot be afforded. It forces societies to confront trade-offs they would rather avoid. Inflation postpones that reckoning. It buys time at the cost of trust. But time is not infinite. As interest payments consume larger shares of public budgets, the pressure intensifies. As populations age, the tax base shrinks. As inequality widens, political stability weakens. The hidden tax becomes harder to hide. Some governments are beginning to acknowledge this reality. Discussions of wealth taxes, fiscal discipline, and monetary reform are re-emerging. Others double down, hoping growth or innovation will outrun the debt. There is no painless path forward. The future unfolds along several possible trajectories. In one scenario, governments restore discipline. Inflation is tamed. Debt is restructured or gradually reduced. Growth becomes slower, but more stable. In another, inflation remains the preferred tool. Purchasing power continues to erode. Asset inequality deepens. Social tensions rise. And in the worst case, confidence collapses. Currencies weaken, capital flees. The hidden tax becomes overt and explosive. Which path societies choose is not predetermined. It is shaped by political will, institutional trust, and collective understanding. And that understanding begins with seeing inflation for what it truly is. Not just a technical variable, not just a market outcome, but a silent policy choice. One that answers an uncomfortable question. If taxes didn't rise and spending didn't fall, then someone still paid. The bill was simply passed in a different form. To the saver who watched their purchasing power fade. To the worker whose wages lagged behind prices. To the young generation priced out before they even entered the system. The hidden tax does not appear on a statement, but its consequences are written across the modern economy. And the longer it remains unseen, the more expensive it becomes. Understanding this does not offer easy solutions, but it does restore something essential: clarity. Because only when societies recognize how costs are truly distributed can they begin to debate, honestly, who should bear them, and what kind of future they are willing to pay for. There is another layer to the hidden tax that rarely enters public debate: how it quietly changes what people believe is normal. When inflation persists year after year, expectations adjust. Not upward mobility, but survival becomes the benchmark. A generation ago, saving money was an act of discipline rewarded over time. Interest compounded, purchasing power was preserved. Today, saving often feels like a mistake. Cash loses value. Low-risk assets fail to keep pace. And the message is subtle but clear. If you don't own appreciating assets, you fall behind. This is not just an economic distortion. It is a behavioral one. Households begin to speculate not because they want to, but because they feel they must. Housing becomes less a place to live, more a financial lifeboat. Stocks, crypto, collectibles, anything that might outrun inflation. Attract capital not out of optimism, but fear. The hidden tax doesn't encourage productivity. It encourages financialization. And this has consequences for the real economy. When capital flows toward existing assets instead of new productive investment, growth slows. Innovation concentrates. Small businesses struggle to compete with asset-backed incumbents. Wages stagnate even as balance sheets inflate. This is how an economy can appear wealthy on paper while feeling fragile on the ground. The effects are visible in cities across the developed world. Luxury apartments stand empty while workers commute farther each year. Retail districts fill with financial services rather than goods. Young families delay children, home ownership, even marriage, not out of choice, but constraint. Over time, the hidden tax reshapes demographics. Lower birth rates, delayed milestones, a shrinking base of contributors supporting a growing pool of obligations. And as these pressures accumulate, the political consequences intensify. When people feel that the system no longer rewards effort, trust erodes. Institutions are questioned. Experts are dismissed. Simple narratives gain traction over complex truths. Inflation, in this sense, is not just an economic force. It is a legitimacy problem. Governments promise stability, yet deliver uncertainty. Central banks promise control, yet appear reactive. Citizens are told the system is working, while their lived experience says otherwise. This gap between narrative and reality is where polarization thrives. History shows that prolonged economic pressure rarely ends quietly. It ends with reform, or rupture. The hidden tax delays confrontation, but it also raises the stakes. The longer costs are deferred, the sharper the eventual adjustment. This is why understanding inflation matters beyond spreadsheets and statistics. It shapes how people plan their lives, how they relate to institutions, how they imagine the future. And perhaps most importantly, it determines whether societies face hard choices deliberately or stumble into them by force. Because inflation is not destiny. It is a policy outcome. And policies, unlike forces of nature, can be changed once they are seen clearly.